Well, I've got the pleasure to chair the discussion of all three presentations. So please, if you've got an immediate question, use the hand raise function. But I know that there was already a question for Lucy in the chat by Bethan. Bethan, do you want to ask the question yourself, or shall I just read it out loud?
It's very much what's written there. I was just interested in where the painting had come from, you know, the source of it. Was it part of some therapy process, or was it occupational health as part of John's time in psychiatric hospital, or, you know, where did the art come from? That was my question. Or maybe you don't know.
Do you want me to answer now? Shall I? Thank you for the question. That's a really good question. As far as I know, part of the reason why they wanted to do an exhibition was because he was drawing all over everything. So I don't think it was an art therapy session or it was anything kind of guided. I think it was literally just on bed sheets and all sorts of things, as far as I know. Yeah.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Okay. Any other immediate questions? I mean, Lucy, what I think what was interesting about your presentation was, yeah, that, you know, that, I mean, it's a bit Luhmann, isn't it, system theory, but this idea of how different systems within a society generate sometimes competitive understandings of art. And I thought what was striking in regard to your talk was that, well, that's kind of the, well, sorry, I should have thought of that question first, but how law and art market dynamics kind of seem to work together, because kind of law more or less measuring a terrain of normativity, yeah, and by then saying, okay, this goes kind of beyond convenient art making, and then of course this is where the art market sets in and sees its new resource for capitalizing it. So I thought that was very interesting. I'm not sure whether you have anything to add to this.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Yeah, that's how I've been seeing it as well. And it's interesting when I think there's some work done on forgeries. So how when yeah, as soon as something becomes has capital attached to it, then obviously there's some notion that there might be theft involved, or that there would be then people trying to repeat that value elsewhere, and obviously the law plays a big part in that. So yeah, so there's kind of the direction in which art, or at least contemporary art, or I suppose art as a broad field, has continued. Yeah, when you look at intellectual property, for instance, it's based on property, so it's very much seen as the author and the rights are property based, and capital is connected to that, isn't it? So yeah, I'd see it as very much the same, definitely. Thank you. Yeah.
Alexander, if I'm correct, you are next.
Yes, thank you. I mean, in a way, all three papers are about revolutions, aren't they? And I was also fascinated with John the Painter, and I wondered where does the name come from? Is this a self-designation, or is it someone else who called him like this? I'm asking because there is John the Painter, the saboteur, during the American Revolution, who I think was executed by hanging from the largest gallows ever, which was the mast of a ship. I mean, he blew up things and committed arson and so on. And I mean, giving yourself a new constitution is a revolution in kind. And I mean, the revolutionary calendar in the French Revolution was, of course, abolished, and in the case of the Paris Commune, quite brutally abolished and crushed by, well, I mean, shooting down the whole place. I mean, those are just a few ideas, but I would be interested about John the Painter's name.
Yeah, again, as far as I know, it was assigned to him. So I don't think he had any role in that. So yeah, so I'm assuming that it was a pseudonym that was supposed to be anonymous, but obviously it was drawing from previous history as well. And yeah, it's very, I'm not sure whether that was intentional or not on the part of the curators. Yeah, so that's, it's very relevant, obviously, to the discussion today. So yeah, thank you. But as far as I know, he wouldn't have had any role in his, the way that he was being represented, because he wasn't really aware that he was an artist as such. So yeah.
Thank you.
I'd like
And
to,
Elena,
I'd like to
sorry.
comment on Alexandra's question, and also yes, because you talk about the crushing of the calendar and the brief revival in the commune, and I mean, maybe I've also kind of got a question for Felipe here, or that comes out of that, because I think it's that that sense of something can be sort of lost or crushed, but it also kind of simmers. I mean, it stayed there between the first kind of iteration and the second. It resurfaced, and I think that's what interests me about this thing, and why I've become so fascinated with it, is because of this sense of a kind of undercurrent that is still unrealized and possible. And I was just wondering if whether Felipe also saw his work in that sense, as the something, in a way it's sort of, it's crushed by the outcome of the vote, but I wonder whether it felt like a sort of continuing possibility. Have we lost Felipe? Maybe we have.
There. I was silenced. Of course, it's very sad to talk about this, because it's very recent, and I mean, it was a huge depression for lots of people that were very involved in different ways in this. I mean, I was only posting things on social media. There were people doing the hard job, and I didn't do almost anything. But in this case, it's first of all, it's complex, because I have usually draw a very strict division between my my poetic artistic work and the letters to the editors, or whatever opinion I had in politics, in social media, whatever. But in this case, this was mixed, and it was very complicated for me, because, as I said, I have been very strict and not putting those things together, but it became inevitable. In fact, it's funny, because lots of people know me as a poet that writes letters to the editor, but no one has read any of my poems. I mean, everything is online, you can download it for free. I mean, no one reads my poems, I think, except for these kind of things or the letters. So, well, whatever. But yeah, but related to your question, I think what I like most about this kind of poetry or writing is precisely what the word that the Eulipians have in mind, potential, and I mean it has potential. Writing a serial poem, writing a sonnet is also working with restrictions and models and prototypes, or a sextina or whatever kind of work with restrictions. Paradoxically, as the Eulipians found, they are full of potential. So I mean, for me, this goes beyond the specific result of the plebiscite. Yeah. And also, of course, it's related to the collaborative work. I mean, everything that happened after the first publication was because of people that invited me or wanted to collaborate, and I had this text on my hand. So, well, let's do something. So, and they did a lot with this. I mean, in my case, I wrote the lyrics of the song only.
Yeah, great. I really enjoyed that.
Elena.
Hi, thanks. Thanks, Sarah. Well, a little bit of my mind is still in the first part of our session this afternoon. I'm still thinking of the word avant. And thinking how it kind of works for me, I think, as a kind of metaphor for what we're discussing today. Because I think, you know, you've got the river, but it's part of a kind of cyclical overall water cycle, which kind of brings in what Thomas was talking about in terms of past, present, and future. But also, I think when I think of a river, what you have are all the kind of little kind of features of the ecosystem, the pools and the eddies and the riffles and the outcropping rocks or whatever, that causes these kind of turbulences and interruptions, which also seems to talk to some of the things we've been talking about today. And I think, you know, in this last session now, what we've seen are real life examples of little kind of interruptions, and it's the same with the earlier talks as well. Yeah, so I think that's really interesting. So I've been thinking about the word avant as a kind of metaphor for a lot of the things that we've been talking about. But I think so that's one thing that's been occupying me. And then I was thinking about Lucy's talk, and I'm also interested in law, and I've looked in particular at what happens in reality on the ground with legislation, and how law becomes socialized by everyday practice. And so you know, for me, law is about kind of creating rules, but it's always in a state of flux. Law itself is like part of a river flow, isn't it? It's always in flux, and there's always this element of, yes, you can create and set up these rules that become inscribed by language. You can be creative in interpreting law, but ultimately in the way law is manifested on the ground, it becomes morphed by socialization, social practices. And so I was thinking, is that the role really of art or any kind of creative practice, everyday practice really, is to drive law forwards, to drive legislation forwards by always kind of pushing and kind of reshaping law around the edges and driving it forwards, and sometimes in different directions. Sorry, I think those are just kind of set of like just thoughts, not really a question, but perhaps there is a question there for Lucy in terms of, are we really talking about the role of art under the creative practices as a force for changing law over time?
Thank you, Eleanor. I'll just jump in. Yes, I think you're right. I think you know it's there's what's called in law called the mirror theory. So that law is supposed to reflect what's happening in society and vice versa. So that law should be either one step behind what's happening in society or somewhere near it. I suppose art could also try to be breaking the law as well, in order to push the law in another direction. So I suppose, yeah, like you say, it's a confluence, isn't it? It's a constantly moving thing, and artists have made use of that as well by making contracts with their work, or actually making law with their work as well. So it's yeah, whether or not explicitly or not, I suppose. But no, I think, yeah, really great way of putting it. Definitely that law should be something that, or law is something that artists are trying to embed. Yeah.
But can I jump in there? There was a recent example in Germany when an artwork triggered a change or the abolishment of an old legislation on Alexander, what's Majestätsbeleidigung? But if you offend the head of state, Jan Böhmermann, who wrote a poem about Erdogan, a critical, satirical, you could read it as very offending a poem, and of course he was prosecuted for it. But in the end, through parliament process, that law was abolished because it referred to 19th century German monarchy. Yeah,
right.
So really,
yeah. That's a great example. Yeah, I think where people are, I suppose that can happen either through artists, I suppose, explicitly doing that, and then and then the law changing as a result. Or then you could sort of see it as that kind of art life breaking down, where in a case by case that kind of happens as well, when at least in sort of when a case happens and then the law changes. And but yeah, I didn't know about that. I'd love to hear more about that. So yeah, thank you.
Thomas.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe just connecting the idea of pushing art forward with law to what Felipe did, in my eyes at least, is like the idea of pushing the new constitution in Chile forward, or bringing it into the state of that in the referendum the people vote in favor of it. But it was there were many artistic interventions in Chile, as far as I know. For instance, the famous one was of La Tesis, the feminist collective, who planted all the or made thematically all the violence against women a theme for the constitution. And they made it with performance, and they made in public spaces, and they had a lot of other feminist groups who copied them or made the same performances in other places about the violador eres tú. So you have like this, I would say, communication between the art system, if we stay with Luhmann, and the system of law in some way. And I think it's always that art is pushing, or art can create a situation which forces the law to be changed by, and that's the point, because the constitution, which has failed in Chile, was successful in Bolivia in 2009, and it was successful because you had this counter-hegemonic artistic cultural movement as a mass movement. And there's also an aspect of avant-garde, in my opinion, within this movement, which doesn't make it neither folkloric nor traditional, but it's a modern avant-gardistic mass movement, which can also push political issues on top of the list in a country. So I think this is a very important aspect of what also Lucy said. And the other thing, when Zoë presented the question of nature, is also in the idea of past, the present, and future as another idea of time, as nature plays, in my opinion, a very important role, or is more considerable. Lucy also said that of the glaciers, if I'm not wrong with that. So I think this is also something which connects very good the idea of what happens, or the idea of this popular movement in Bolivia, because the idea of Pacha, it's also nature, and it's all it's the mountains, the Apus are part of the Pacha, and the Apus, the mountains, are wise characters who protect you.
Thank
So
you.
it was also not a question, sorry.
Excellent.
I wanted to thanks very much, Thomas. And indeed, the Bolivian constitution was kind of a model for lots of the people who wrote the constitution, but also it was a counter model for lots of people that wanted to criticize the new constitution. Chile is a very racist country. It has a different race composition than Bolivia, and Chileans usually are very despective to Bolivians, and there have been wars and whatever. So lots of people, when they wanted to criticize the new constitution, said we're going to become like Bolivia. So they were because Chile has this idea that we are a modern country, that we are like European. You might laugh at this, but some Chileans said that we are the English of Latin America. It's very absurd. But I mean, you can get the idea of how the context was. I mean, lots of people had similar ideas to those that were related to Bolivian constitution, and for others it was just the opposite. And yeah, you mentioned Las Tesis. Probably Las Tesis and the Light Lab were the two most important artistic movements that started in during the uprising. I've been in touch with Las Tesis. They are amazing. They have done a great job also. And yeah, in the case of them, it's funny because I just bought a book they wrote. I mean, they published like 2 weeks ago, and they were talking about this is very interesting for me, the property of the work. Yeah, and in my case, I was delighted that everyone, I mean, I could collaborate, and maybe some people could use it and spread it wherever they wanted. And it was the same case with Las Tesis, that they shared the work, the performance with everyone who wanted to perform it in lots of different countries. But in this book they just published, they talk about that when they wanted to register a website for the work, Las Tesis, it was already registered by some guys, and also similar names were registered by guys that wanted to sell it to them, the address of their own name. So it's funny that when you see like this generosity and sharing, of course the capitalists and I don't know, the most vile kind of people appear at the same time. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, if there are no further immediate questions, I think we deserved a break, which is a bit shortened to about 18 minutes. But enough time, I think, to make a proper cup of tea and maybe eat a bar of chocolates. So see you all back in about 15 minutes. And thank you again to Zoe, Felipe, and Lucy, and everyone who shared.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you.